Mother, we need to discuss your living situation. It's becoming a liability. The words hung in the air of my own living room, colder than the hum of the old air conditioner. My son, Marcus, sat opposite me in the armchair my late husband, Robert, used to favour. He looked so important in his tailored suit, the CEO of the company Robert and I built from nothing in our garage. A cold dread, sharp as a needle, pricked my heart. He wasn't just talking about the house, the one with the porch swing I picked out, and the rose bushes Robert planted. He was talking about my life. I clutched the knitted afghan on my lap a little tighter. The faint scent of lemon polish from my morning's work filled the room, a smell of home and order. A liability? I asked. My voice was quiet, but it felt steady. Marcus sighed, a sound of practiced patience he probably used on his employees. He was looking past me at the staircase. Exactly. This big house, all these stairs, it's just not practical anymore. My whole life reduced to a single dismissive word. He stood up, his expensive leather shoes squeaking on the hardwood floors I'd polished just yesterday. He gestured around the room, at the photos on the mantel and the books stacked neatly on the end table. It's just too much for you now, Mother. His wife, Susan, sat beside him on the sofa, nodding like one of those little dogs people put in their car windows. And remember that fall you had, Eleanor? She said, her voice dripping with false concern. We were so worried. The fall. I'd slipped on a bit of water from the dog's bowl 2 months ago and gotten a bruise on my hip. Marcus made it sound like I was tumbling down the stairs every day. The garden, too, Susan added, glancing out the window at my prize-winning roses. All those roots and uneven paths. It's a real safety hazard. My garden was not a hazard. It was my sanctuary. It was the one place I still felt close to Robert. The idea of them seeing it as a problem felt like a betrayal. I set my teacup down on its saucer. The little clink of porcelain was the only sound in the room for a moment. My doctor gave me a clean bill of health last Tuesday, I said, looking directly at Marcus. And my church group meets here for Bible study every week. I manage just fine. Marcus waved a dismissive hand, as if swatting away a fly. We know you think you do, Mother. We're just being proactive. It's for your own good. That phrase always came before something that was absolutely not for my own good. He and Susan stood to leave. The air felt thick with things unsaid. At the door, Marcus turned back, his hand on the polished brass knob. I've found a wonderful, secure facility just a few miles from us, he said, his voice bright and final. I'd like you to tour it with me next week. After the front door clicked shut, the silence in the house was deafening. The only sound was the steady tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the hall, counting out the seconds of my new, uncertain life. I walked over to the mantel and looked up at the portrait of Robert, painted on our 25th anniversary. His eyes were kind, and I could almost hear him asking if I was all right. I felt a wave of shame, as if I was letting him down. We had built everything together. The company, this house, our family. Now our son saw me as a line item on a balance sheet. A problem to be managed. Not his mother, not the co-founder of his company, but a liability. The word echoed in the quiet house, ugly and sharp. The phone rang later that afternoon, its shrill sound cutting through the heavy silence. It was my daughter, Clara. Her voice was like a warm blanket. Hi, Mum. Just calling to see how you are? I could hear my grandchildren laughing in the background, a happy, chaotic noise. I'm fine, dear. Just fine, I said, tracing the floral pattern on the wallpaper with my finger. It was a lie, and it tasted like ash in my mouth. Marcus stopped by, didn't he? She asked. Her tone was careful. She knew her brother. "Yes, just a quick visit," I said, keeping my voice light. He and Susan said hello. I couldn't bring myself to tell her the truth. I didn't want to put her in the middle, to force her to choose a side. But as I hung up the phone, the secrecy felt heavy. It was the first time I had ever hidden something so important from my daughter. A few days later, a thick, glossy envelope arrived in the mail. It wasn't addressed in my son's familiar scrawl. The label was printed, crisp and impersonal, from the Vance Innovations office. My hands felt cold as I slit it open with my silver letter opener, the one Robert gave me for our anniversary. Inside was a brochure for a place called Golden Meadows Assisted Living. The paper was slick and heavy. The pictures showed smiling seniors with perfect white hair, playing checkers or doing gentle water aerobics. There wasn't a single wrinkle of worry on any of their faces. They looked vacant, like dolls. I could almost smell the faint scent of bleach and bland soup just by looking at the photos. Marcus couldn't even be bothered to mail it himself. He had his assistant do it. That little detail hurt more than the brochure itself. Tucked inside the back flap was a form, an application. My name, Eleanor Vance, was already typed neatly at the top. That Tuesday, I drove myself to my weekly bridge game at the church hall. The air inside smelled of coffee and Carol's lavender perfume. The familiar snap of cards and the gentle clinking of teacups usually calmed me, but not today. "You're quiet, Eleanor," Carol said, laying down a 7 of clubs. "Everything all right?" I just nodded and sorted my cards. I didn't want to bring my troubles to the table. But later, while we were cleaning up, Carol put her hand on my arm. "I heard from my sister," she said, her voice low. "They finally put Bill in that home. He fought it for a year." She shook her head, her lips a thin line. "It started with a brochure in the mail. Once they start, Eleanor, they don't stop. It's a campaign." Her words landed like stones in my stomach. A campaign. That's exactly what it felt like. Not a concerned son, but a strategist. The phone rang that evening, just as I was watching the news. I knew it was him before I even picked it up. "Hello, Marcus," I said. "Mother," he began, and I could hear the false cheerfulness in his voice. He was speaking slowly, too, the way you speak to a child or someone you think is hard of hearing. "I was just calling to check in. Did you happen to get that packet I sent over?" "I received a brochure," I said, my voice flat. "Wonderful. It's a top-notch facility. We should schedule a tour." Something inside me just snapped. It wasn't loud or angry. It was quiet and cold. "I'm busy, Marcus." I placed the receiver back in its cradle before he could say another word. My hand was trembling on the cool plastic. The only sound in the room was the low hum of the refrigerator. I had never, not once in his entire life, hung up the phone on my son. The trembling in my hand eventually stopped, but a new kind of energy took its place. The next morning, I didn't turn on the television. I went to the little desk in the corner of the kitchen where I keep my papers. I pulled out my checkbook ledger and my Social Security statements. The air smelled of old paper and the Earl Grey tea steeping in my cup. Everything was in order. My pension was steady. My Social Security check arrived on the 3rd of every month, regular as clockwork. But then I looked at the dividend statements from Vance Innovations. I spread them out on the polished wood of the kitchen table. They seemed small. Smaller than I remembered from years past. A little flicker of suspicion started in my gut. It was an ugly, unfamiliar feeling. Had Marcus been managing my finances as well as my life? I knew I had to see the real papers, the ones Robert and I signed all those years ago. I walked down the hall to Robert's old study. I hadn't opened the door in years. It was his sanctuary. The afternoon sun cut through the dusty blinds, lighting up the motes of dust dancing in the air. It still smelled faintly of his leather chair and the lemon polish I used on his big oak desk. I ran my hand over the smooth, cool wood. I remembered something he'd said to me long ago when the company was just starting to take off. "Ellie," he'd said, "if anything ever happens, the most important papers are not in this house." He'd tapped the side of his nose. "I have a key." A key to a safe deposit box. He kept it in the back of his top desk drawer. My resolve hardened, pushing the fear away. I pulled on the brass handle of the drawer. I am not a liability. I am the co-founder of Vance Innovations. I just had to find the proof. I found the key in Robert's old desk, tucked inside a dusty manila envelope. His familiar, strong handwriting was on the front. "For Eleanor, just in case." The metal felt cold and solid in my palm. It wasn't a house key. It was for our safe deposit box at the downtown bank, a box I hadn't thought about in years. I felt like a spy in my own life, putting on my good coat and driving into town with a secret purpose. The bank had been renovated. It smelled of new carpet and cleaning fluid instead of old money. The manager was a young man in a suit that was too tight in the shoulders. He looked right through me. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he asked, his eyes already scanning for someone more important. "I need to access my safe deposit box," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. He led me to a small desk and asked for my name. "Eleanor Vance." He typed it into his computer, and his posture changed. He sat up a little straighter. He looked from the screen to my face and back again. Suddenly, he couldn't have been more helpful. Inside the vault, he pulled out a long, heavy metal box. It made a solid thud when he placed it on the table in the private viewing room. Inside, sitting right on top, was our original incorporation binder and a thick stack of share certificates held together with a brittle rubber band. That evening, I didn't turn on the television. The silence in the house felt different. It was full of purpose. I spread the documents across the polished surface of my dining room table, the one Robert and I bought at an auction 40 years ago. The air filled with the faint, dry scent of old paper. The legal language was dense, full of words like heretofore and whereas. But the numbers were simple. I traced the columns with my finger, my reading glasses perched on my nose. I added them up twice, just to be sure. Then a third time. It was all there, clear as the church bells on a Sunday morning. I owned 51% of Vance Innovations. Not Robert and I. Just me. He had placed his shares into a private trust years before he passed, with me as the sole beneficiary. It was never part of the estate. It was never meant to be split. A deep, cold feeling washed over me. It wasn't victory. It was anger, pure and clean as ice. Marcus had been running the company as if his father's shares had been divided between him and Clara. He must have assumed I'd never look, that I'd be too old, too sad, too confused. He didn't know the truth, or he was hoping I'd go to my grave without ever discovering it. He saw me as a problem to be managed, a line item on his budget. He wasn't just trying to put me in a home to be safe. He was trying to bury me, and the truth, before I became an inconvenience. I rested my hands on the cool wood of the table and took a long, slow breath. I needed a lawyer. Not the slick young man in the glass tower that Marcus kept on retainer for the company. I needed someone who remembered the beginning. I went into Robert's study and pulled his old, worn address book from the drawer. The leather was soft with age. I flipped through the pages, past names of friends who were long gone, until I found it. Abernathy. Arthur. His number was written in Robert's neat script, He had to be nearly 80 now if he was even still with us. My hand trembled just a little as I picked up the phone and dialed. An old man's voice answered, thin and crackly like old parchment. "Hello? Mr. Abernathy?" I asked. "This is Eleanor Vance." There was a pause on the other end of the line. The frailness in his voice disappeared, replaced by a sudden, sharp clarity. "Eleanor," he said, "I've been wondering when you might call." We met for coffee the next day at a small diner that smelled of bacon and old-fashioned brewed coffee. Arthur Abernathy was thinner than I remembered, and he walked with a cane, but his eyes were like chips of blue steel. He stirred his coffee, the spoon making a soft clinking sound against the ceramic mug. I told him everything. I told him about Marcus, the liability comment, the nursing home brochure, and the documents in the safe deposit box. He listened without interrupting, his gaze fixed on my face. When I finished, a slow, thin smile spread across his lips. He took a sip of his coffee. "They thought my name was on the house," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "They forgot it was on the company." Arthur nodded, setting his cup down gently. "Eleanor, your husband was a brilliant man," he said, his voice low and steady. "And he was no fool. He foresaw this." The phone rang on Tuesday morning, right on schedule. The sound of the church bells had just faded. I was watering my African violets on the windowsill, and I let it ring 3 times before I picked it up. I knew it was him. "Mother?" Marcus's voice was bright and false. "Just checking in. I wanted to schedule that tour of Golden Meadows for this Friday. Say, 10 o'clock? I took a slow breath. I could feel the cool plastic of the receiver against my ear. The hum of the refrigerator filled the kitchen. "No," I said. My voice was quiet, but it didn't shake. There was a pause. "No? What do you mean, no?" "Mother, we discussed this. It's for your own good." "No, thank you, Marcus. I will not be going on Friday, or any other day." I looked at the portrait of Robert on the far wall. His eyes seemed to approve. "You confused my silence with my consent. They are not the same thing." The silence on the other end of the line was thick and heavy. It was the sound of a gear grinding to a halt. It was the most beautiful sound I had heard all week. Mr. Abernathy suggested we meet at his office. It was a small, dusty place above a hardware store, smelling of old paper and pipe tobacco. He poured me a cup of tea in a delicate china cup that looked out of place on his cluttered desk. "So," he said, peering at me over his spectacles, "the boy thinks his mother is a liability." He chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. "Robert always said Marcus had ambition, but not much sense." I explained my plan. I told him about the shares, the quiet way Robert had protected me. He listened, nodding slowly. When I finished, he leaned back in his creaky leather chair. "This isn't a family squabble, Eleanor. What we are planning is a corporate restructuring." I smiled, feeling the warmth from the teacup seep into my hands. "You call it what you like, Arthur. I call it taking back my life." Our first step was simple. Using my authority as majority shareholder, we sent a letter through his office requesting a complete, independent audit of Vance Innovations. We asked for a special focus on executive compensation. We didn't send it to Marcus. We sent it directly to the company's chief financial officer. The quietest moves are often the loudest. The next day, I called Clara. No more secrets. "Can you meet your old mother for lunch?" I asked. "My treat." We met at the Corner Bistro, a little place with checkered tablecloths and good iced tea. We made small talk for a few minutes. I asked about her work. She gave me the same tired answers. Her new marketing proposal had been shelved. A project she started was now being led by one of Marcus's friends. After the waitress brought our salads, I reached into my large handbag. I pulled out the manila envelope from the safe deposit box. I slid the thick, cream-colored share certificates across the table, right next to her water glass. She looked down at them. Her fork stopped halfway to her mouth. I watched her read the words, her eyes widening. She looked from the papers to my face, then back to the papers. The name printed there, over and over, was mine. Eleanor Vance, 51%. "Mom," she whispered, her voice full of shock, and then a slow, dawning understanding. I let her take it all in. Then I leaned forward and asked the most important question of my life. "Clara, if the opportunity arose, would you be prepared to lead the company?" Clara pushed her salad away. The colour had risen in her cheeks. "He took credit for the Sterling account," she said, her voice low and tight. "My account. He told the board it was his initiative." She told me how he'd called her ideas sentimental and not aggressive enough for the current market. She had been fighting a battle on the inside for years, and I never even knew. She thought she was alone. She thought Marcus held all the cards. Now she was looking at the whole deck, right there on the table between the salt and pepper shakers. "He underestimates you," I said softly. "He underestimates both of us. That has always been his biggest weakness." She finally looked up from the certificates, and her eyes were clear and steady. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I would be prepared." A little smile touched her lips. "I've been prepared for 5 years." We sat there for another hour, our iced teas forgotten. We weren't just mother and daughter anymore. We were partners. Our alliance was forged right there, on a red and white checkered tablecloth. A few days later, a crisp white envelope arrived from the Homeowners Association. It was a formal complaint. My rose bushes, the ones Robert planted for our 25th anniversary, were overgrown and in violation of community standards. I could feel Susan's perfectly manicured fingerprints all over it. Another little push. Another way to say, "You can't even manage a garden. How can you manage a house?" The meeting was in the stuffy community clubhouse, which always smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant. I sat in the back while they droned on about parking permits and holiday decorations. When they called my name, I walked to the front. I felt a dozen pairs of eyes on me. I didn't make a scene. I simply opened the HOA bylaws to page 14, section B. I read aloud the part about heritage plantings being exempt from standard size restrictions. Then I presented a dated photograph of Robert planting those very bushes 30 years ago. The board president, a fussy little man named Mr. Henderson, cleared his throat. "Well, everything appears to be in order. Complaint dismissed." Walking out into the fresh evening air, I felt a spark. It was small, but it was there. It was the woman who had built a company from nothing, sitting in a folding chair in a stuffy room, winning a tiny war with a piece of paper. It felt good. It felt like practice. The preliminary audit results arrived on a Tuesday. Mr. Abernathy didn't call. He brought them to my house himself, in a thin manila folder that felt heavier than a stack of bricks. We sat at my kitchen table, the scent of lemon polish in the air. He pushed the papers across the oak surface. "It's worse than we thought, Eleanor," he said, his voice quiet. I read the columns of numbers. The words swam a little, but the figures were sharp and cruel. An enormous salary for Marcus. Bonuses he'd given himself for projects that had failed. And then the consulting fees. Tens of thousands of dollars paid out to companies owned by his golf buddies. He wasn't just running the company into the ground. He was looting it. He was taking the house Robert and I had built, board by board, and selling it for firewood. "He's been bleeding it dry," I whispered. A small tremor started in my hands, a cold, hard anger that felt nothing like grief. Mr. Abernathy just nodded. He left a trail a mile wide. He never thought anyone would look. He thought I was just a liability, after all. The next afternoon, Clara came over. I made iced tea, the way she likes it, with fresh mint from my garden. We sat with Mr. Abernathy in my living room, the fan humming softly overhead. The audit papers were laid out on the coffee table between us. Clara's face was pale as she looked them over. I had no idea, she said, her voice tight. I knew things were bad, but not this. He hid it well, Mr. Abernathy said. But the authority to act is yours, Eleanor. All yours. I looked at my daughter, at the strength in her jaw that reminded me so much of her father. All the pieces were there. The proof, the power, the plan. My hands were perfectly steady. My voice was clear. I picked up the telephone from the end table, its plastic cool against my palm. I dialed the number for the corporate secretary's office, a number I hadn't called in 15 years. "Hello, Mary," I said when she answered. "This is Eleanor Vance. I am exercising my right as majority shareholder to call an emergency board meeting for Friday at 9 a.m. On the morning of the board meeting, I put on the navy blue suit I wore to the company's 10th anniversary gala. It still fit perfectly. The silk lining felt smooth and cool against my skin. I didn't feel nervous, just ready. I walked into the boardroom at 5 minutes to 9. The air smelled of expensive coffee and entitlement. The board members, all men Marcus had appointed, looked up from their phones with mild curiosity. Marcus was at the head of the long, polished table. He saw me, and a look of irritation crossed his face, quickly followed by a patronizing smile. "Mother, have you lost your way?" he asked, loud enough for everyone to hear. "The reception area is down the hall." I didn't answer him. I walked past the other chairs, right to the head of the table. I pulled out the heavy leather chair, his chair, and sat down. Mr. Abernathy walked in right behind me. He carried a thin leather briefcase. He didn't say a word. He simply walked around the table and placed a single, slim packet in front of each board member. He placed one in front of Marcus, too. There was a rustle of paper as they opened the folders. Inside was a copy of my share certificate, a copy of the trust documents Robert had established, a single-page summary of my 51% controlling interest. The room, which had been buzzing with quiet murmurs, went completely silent. The only sound was the hum of the air conditioning. I watched Marcus's face. He scanned the first page, then the second. The smug confidence slid away. The healthy, tanned colour drained from his cheeks, leaving behind a sickly, grey pallor. He looked from the papers to me, his eyes wide with a kind of shock that had nothing to do with concern for my health. I stood up slowly. I rested my hands on the back of the tall leather chair. My voice didn't waver. It was as calm and steady as the church bells on a Sunday morning. "Good morning, gentlemen," I began. I laid out the facts, one by one. The company's declining performance over the last 3 years, the loss of 2 major clients, the inflated executive pay, documented in the audit, the founder's vision of innovation and employee care being ignored. I never mentioned the nursing home. I never said the word liability. This was not about a mother's hurt feelings. This was business. I let the silence hang in the air for a moment when I was done. "Therefore," I said, my eyes locked on my son's, "I call for a vote of no confidence in the current CEO, Marcus Vance." Marcus turned a dark, ugly shade of red. He slammed his hand on the polished table, making the water glasses jump. "This is absurd!" he shouted, his voice echoing off the wood paneling. "She doesn't know what she's doing. She's confused. For God's sake, we were about to put her in a home." The other board members, men Marcus had played golf with for years, shifted in their leather chairs. They looked at the audit summary Mr. Abernathy had provided. They looked at the falling profit margins. Then they looked at me. I met their gazes, one by one. I didn't see pity in their eyes. I saw them doing sums in their heads. They weren't looking at a frail old woman anymore. They were looking at the majority shareholder. I kept my hands folded on the table in front of me. The fabric of my navy suit felt steady and familiar. "I believe I called for a vote," I said into the silence. My voice was quiet, but everyone heard it. Marcus sputtered, "You can't—" I looked directly at him. "I hold 51% of the voting shares," I said, my voice as calm as a summer morning. "The vote is a formality, but let us proceed." Mr. Abernathy gave a small nod to the board secretary. One by one, they went around the table. I. Each word was a small, clean nail in the coffin of my son's career. Marcus just sat there, his mouth slightly open. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. I didn't pause. I didn't give anyone time to think. "My second motion," I announced, "is to nominate Clara Vance as the new Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately." A murmur went through the room. I laid out Clara's history with the company. I described the innovative projects she had proposed, the ones Marcus had laughed at and shelved. I spoke of her dedication, her intelligence, and her deep understanding of what her father and I had wanted to build. "All in favor?" I asked. This time the eyes came quickly, almost eagerly. Clara nodded at me from across the table, her eyes shining. It was the beginning of something new. The meeting was over. A quiet security guard, a man I'd seen at the gate for 20 years, came into the room. He walked over to Marcus and spoke softly. "Sir, I need to escort you from the building." Marcus didn't argue. He didn't even seem to be breathing. He gathered his briefcase, his hands clumsy. He walked to the door without looking at me, without looking at his sister. The heavy door clicked shut behind him. Across the polished table, Clara and I just looked at each other. The hum of the air conditioning suddenly seemed very loud. The feeling wasn't happiness, not exactly. It was like a heavy weight had finally been lifted from my chest. But I wondered what would come next. The news was in the financial papers the next morning. Vance Innovations sees shake-up. Founder's widow installs daughter as CEO. My phone started ringing before I'd even finished my toast. Friends, old colleagues, news reporters. I let the machine pick up. The sound of their voices filled the quiet house. I didn't answer a single call. Instead, I put on my gardening gloves and went outside. The air smelled of damp earth and the sweet perfume of my rose bushes. The sun was warm on my back. I took my favorite pruning shears and began to snip away the dead branches, making way for new growth. I snipped a perfect deep red rose and brought it inside. The house was quiet, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like my own. My son did not stay quiet for long. A week after the board meeting, a thick envelope arrived by courier. It was from a law firm I didn't recognize. My hands felt steady as I opened it. The letter was full of legal words, but the message was simple. Marcus was threatening to go to court to have me declared mentally incompetent. He wanted to take control of my assets, my home, my life. He called me a danger to the company's stability. He was still calling me a liability. I didn't panic. I picked up the phone, the heavy black receiver feeling cool in my hand. "Mr. Abernathy," I said when he answered. The letter has arrived." "I expected it would," he said, his voice crackling with dry amusement. "Don't you worry, Eleanor. We are prepared." He sent our response the very next day. It included a full medical report from my doctor, Dr. Evans, who I'd been seeing for 20 years. It included a psychiatric evaluation I had taken the week before, just in case. The psychiatrist said I was sharper than most people half my age, but Mr. Abernathy didn't stop there. The final page of his letter informed Marcus's lawyer that if he proceeded, we would be filing a countersuit for financial mismanagement and embezzlement during his time as CEO. After that, my phone stayed silent. The call from my daughter-in-law, Susan, came on a Tuesday morning. I was in the kitchen, wiping down my counters, and the smell of lemon polish was in the air. Her voice was high and thin, like a wire stretched too tight. "Eleanor, how could you do this?" she sobbed. "You've ruined us. You've destroyed your own son." I listened as she went on about their reputation, the mortgage on their big house, the country club membership. She never once mentioned my well-being. She never once mentioned the nursing home. I waited until she paused for breath. "Susan," I said, and my voice was perfectly calm. "I didn't do anything to your family." "What do you call this?" she shrieked. "This is cruel. You should have thought of that before you helped him try to put me in a home." I placed the receiver gently back in its cradle. The click was the only sound in my quiet kitchen. A new chapter of my life began. I didn't want to be a CEO. That was Clara's time. But I accepted the title of chairwoman of the board. It sounded so formal for a woman who spent her mornings in a gardening apron. Once a week, I would drive to the Vance Innovations building. I'd sit in the big leather chair at the head of the conference table, the same one Marcus had looked so smug in. I didn't say much. I listened as Clara presented her ideas. I watched as she treated every employee with respect. I offered advice when she asked for it. Under her leadership, the company felt like itself again. It felt like something Robert and I would have been proud of. One of Clara's first big changes was something Robert and I had talked about for years. It was a profit-sharing program for every single employee, from the engineers to the janitors. Robert always said, "A company is a family. When the family does well, everyone should get a slice of the pie." Marcus had called the idea sentimental nonsense. Clara announced it at an all-hands meeting. I was standing at the back of the room. I saw the looks of surprise, then the slow smiles spreading across people's faces. The applause was loud and genuine. Later that day, I walked past my husband's portrait in the lobby. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was honoring his memory, not just protecting it. The company dividends started coming in again, proper ones this time. The checks were larger than I had seen in years. It was more money than I needed for my social security and my groceries. For a week, I just looked at the numbers in my bank book, wondering what to do. Then, I thought of Mary Beth, a bright young woman from my church who was struggling to pay for community college. I called Mr. Abernathy. We set up a small scholarship fund, just for local women trying to get a start in business. The first check went to Mary Beth. I didn't put my name on it. I just called it the Vance Innovations Founders Fund. Holding the pen and signing that check felt like true power. It was the power to build something new, not just fight to keep what was old. A birthday card arrived from Marcus. The envelope was addressed in his wife Susan's perfect, loopy handwriting. Inside, the card had a picture of a sailboat on it. He'd never been sailing in his life. He had written, "Hoping we can talk." I stood over the blue recycling bin in my kitchen, the one for paper and cardboard, and let the card fall from my fingers. It made a soft, satisfying little flutter as it landed on top of an old newspaper. A few days later, my doorbell rang. A young man from a delivery service stood there holding a bouquet of flowers wrapped in crackly cellophane. They were carnations, the cheap, dyed blue kind you see in buckets by the grocery store checkout. The little card tucked inside had the same message. "Hoping we can talk." I thanked the boy and closed the door. I set the bouquet on the counter and looked at it. It smelled faintly of chemicals and refrigeration. He hadn't even bothered to send roses from my own garden. He sent me flowers that had no life in them at all. I settled into a new rhythm. It felt like my own for the first time in years. My mornings were for the garden. I'd go out with my coffee, still in my robe, and feel the cool dampness of the soil on my fingers. The air smelled of earth and roses. Afternoons were for reading in the big armchair by the window, the one that got the best light. The hum of the air conditioner was a gentle companion. Evenings were for people. Sometimes Clara would stop by after work, her key turning in the lock a welcome sound. We'd sit on the porch and talk about nothing and everything. Other nights, my bridge club friends would come for iced tea. My house was a sanctuary again. It was no longer a place where I was waiting for the next bad news. The silence felt like peace, not loneliness. It was a quiet I had chosen. I decided to host a little dinner party, just my bridge group and a few old friends from the company's early days. The house filled with the rich smell of my slow-cooked pot roast. Laughter echoed in the dining room, a sound I hadn't heard in so long. The clinking of forks against my good china plates was like music. Carol raised her wineglass. "To Eleanor," she said, her eyes sparkling. "For having the courage we all wish we had." Everyone murmured in agreement. I felt a blush rise on my cheeks. "It wasn't courage, Carol," I said, looking around the table at my friends. "It was necessity." We all shared a look of understanding, and then someone told a funny story about their grandson, and the moment passed. We just talked and laughed late into the evening, until the moon was high in the sky. Clara came over on a Tuesday afternoon. She spread the quarterly reports on my polished dining room table. The crisp white paper felt important in my hands. We sat with cups of Earl Grey tea, the steam warming my face, and went over the numbers. "Profits are up 15%, Mum," she said, her finger tracing a line on a chart. "And I just signed the Henderson contract. The one Marcus said was a waste of time." I looked at her, at the confident set of her shoulders and the clear, intelligent light in her eyes. A wave of pride washed over me, so strong it almost hurt. "Your father would be so proud of you, Clara," I said softly. "I hope so," she said, meeting my gaze. "I'm just glad you're here to see it." The numbers on the page weren't just about money, they were about a legacy being restored. The phone rang one afternoon. It was Martha, a woman I knew from church. Her voice was thin and shaky. "Eleanor, I'm so sorry to bother you," she began. "But I heard you had some trouble with your family trying to manage your affairs." I listened as she told me a story that was painfully familiar. Her son was trying to get power of attorney, telling her she was too forgetful to handle her own money. "He keeps saying it's for my own good," she whispered, and I could hear the tears in her voice. I walked over to the little desk in my hallway and picked up a business card from the dish. The engraving felt solid and dependable under my thumb. "Martha," I said, my own voice steady and clear. "I'm going to give you a phone number. His name is Arthur Abernathy." I realized then that my story wasn't just mine anymore. The doorbell rang one Tuesday afternoon. I wasn't expecting anyone. Through the peephole I saw Marcus, He looked thin, and his expensive suit hung on him like it belonged to a bigger man. I opened the door. He didn't try to come inside. He just stood on the porch, the afternoon sun making him squint. "Mother," he started, his voice raspy. "I just wanted to say, this has been very difficult for me. I've lost everything." I looked at him, the son I had raised, the man who had called me a liability. "An apology is not about how you feel, Marcus," I said, my voice quiet but steady. "It's about what you did. You have a long way to go." I closed the heavy oak door, the click of the lock sounding very final in the silent hallway. The next weekend, I decided to tackle the guest room. It was where Marcus and Susan used to stay. A faint, cloying scent of Susan's potpourri still hung in the air. I opened the windows wide, letting the smell of cut grass blow through. In the back of the closet was a box of their things, a forgotten sweater, a couple of paperback novels, a cheap souvenir snow globe. I packed it all up and drove it to the Goodwill donation center. I didn't call to ask if they wanted it. I spent the next 2 days painting. I chose a color called Sunbeam Yellow. The room brightened with every stroke of the roller. When I was finished, I stood in the doorway, breathing in the clean smell of new paint. It wasn't a guest room anymore. It was my space now. Clara invited me to the company's annual charity gala. "As chairwoman of the board, you have to be there?" she said, a smile in her voice. I wore my navy blue suit, the one that still felt like armor. We walked in together, Clara's arm linked through mine. The ballroom was filled with the low hum of conversation and the clinking of champagne glasses. People saw me and didn't look away with pity. They came over to shake my hand. "Mrs. Vance, a pleasure to see you." "Eleanor, the company hasn't looked this good in years." I wasn't the CEO's elderly mother, a problem to be managed. I was Eleanor Vance. I saw a few of the board members who had voted Marcus out. They raised their glasses to me from across the room. I gave them a small, dignified nod. For the first time in a long time, I felt seen. A letter arrived a few days later. The envelope was thin, cheap paper from a college bookstore. The handwriting inside was young and a little messy. It was from my grandson, Thomas, Marcus's son. He wrote that he had heard what happened. He said he was ashamed of his father's actions. He apologized for not calling sooner, but he didn't know what to say. "Grandma," he wrote, "I was hoping I could come visit on my winter break. Just me." I sat at my kitchen table, tracing his signature with my finger. The refrigerator hummed softly. A crack of light was showing in a door I thought was sealed shut forever. This was a new beginning, separate from the old pain. I called Mr. Abernathy. "Arthur," I said, "it's time to put the last piece in place." We met at his dusty office, the air smelling of old books and leather. He had the documents ready. My new will was clear and simple. Clara was the executor. My estate would be divided, but Marcus's portion was placed into a strict trust. He would receive a small monthly allowance, enough to live on, but not enough to cause trouble. He could never touch the principal. He could never use it as leverage. I signed the papers with Robert's old fountain pen. The scratch of the nib on the thick paper was a satisfying sound. "It's done," Mr. Abernathy said, his voice gentle. I felt a profound sense of peace. My life and my legacy were finally safe. I decided to take a trip to the coast. It was something Robert and I had always talked about, but there was never time. The company always needed one more thing. I packed a small bag, filled the gas tank in my old Buick, and drove until I could smell the salt in the air. The little motel room had a window that looked right out onto the water. The air conditioner hummed a steady, peaceful tune. I walked on the beach for hours, letting the cold foam wash over my ankles. The sand was cool and damp under my bare feet. I didn't feel lonely. I felt quiet. It wasn't about missing Robert anymore. It was about finishing a promise I'd made to both of us. That evening, I ate fried clams out of a cardboard box on a bench overlooking the ocean. A woman my age sat on the other end of the bench, and we started talking about our grandchildren. It was easy and normal. "You travel alone often?" she asked. "This is my first time," I said. And I realized I wasn't afraid at all. My grandson, Leo, came to visit the next week. He was Marcus's oldest, away at college, and I hadn't seen him in nearly a year. He stood on my porch, looking tall and awkward, clutching a bouquet of daisies from the grocery store. We sat on the porch swing with tall glasses of iced tea. The ice clinked against the glass. He kept clearing his throat, then finally said, "Grandma, I'm so sorry about what my dad did." I reached over and put my hand on his. "That was not your doing, Leo. You are your own person." We talked for a long time about his classes, about a girl he liked. He was a good, kind young man, and I could see he was ashamed of his parents. We were building something new, just the two of us. Before he left, he hesitated at the door. Do you think he'll ever change?" I looked at him, my heart aching a little for his hope. "People can change, sweetheart," I said, "but they have to want to." Clara came by for our weekly coffee a few days later. She brought a cinnamon coffee cake from the good bakery, and the whole kitchen smelled warm and sweet. As I poured the coffee, she mentioned it casually. "I heard Marcus and Susan sold their big house on the hill," she said, not looking at me. "They moved into one of those new condos by the highway." I just nodded and added a little cream to my cup. I felt a flicker of something, a distant sadness for the little boy I raised. But it wasn't guilt. It was just a fact, like a weather report. They had a big, fancy house, but they never made it a home. "Well," I said, taking a bite of cake, "I hope they'll be happy there." Clara looked at me, a small smile on her face. "You know," she said, "I think you're happier now than I've seen you in 20 years. I thought about that, and I realized she was right. The phone rang one afternoon. It was Pastor John from my church. His voice sounded worried. "Eleanor," he said, "our endowment fund is in a bit of a tangle. The man who managed it passed away, and his records are a mess. We need someone with a good head for numbers, someone we can trust." I felt a little spark inside me, a feeling I hadn't had in years. "I might be able to take a look," I told him. The next day, I sat in the quiet church office. It smelled of old paper and lemon polish. I spread the ledgers out on the big oak table. The numbers were confusing at first, but then it all started to click into place, just like it used to. Marcus had called me a liability, but here, in this quiet room, I was being asked to be a guardian of my community's future. Clara asked me to lunch the following Tuesday at a little cafe with bright yellow tablecloths. She seemed nervous, folding and unfolding her paper napkin until it was a soft little wad. My first thought was that something was wrong at the company. "Is everything all right?" I asked, putting my hand over hers. She stopped fidgeting and looked up, her eyes shining. "Everything is wonderful, Mom," she said, her voice soft. "I'm pregnant." The sound in the cafe faded away. All I could see was my daughter's happy face. A wave of pure joy washed over me, so strong it took my breath away. A new life, a new generation, starting with so much strength and love. "Oh, Clara," I whispered. She was laughing now, tears in her eyes. "You're going to be a grandmother again." And I knew, sitting there in the sunlight, that this time I would be a grandmother completely on my own terms. I started knitting a baby blanket, sitting in my favorite armchair by the window. The yarn was a soft, buttery yellow, and it slipped through my fingers like silk. The gentle click-clack of the needles was the only sound in the room, besides the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. The house was quiet, but it was a comfortable, chosen quiet. It was the sound of my own life, running on my own schedule. This wasn't loneliness. This was peace. The afternoon sun streamed through the glass, warming the worn fabric of the chair. I paused for a moment, resting my hands in my lap. I looked at the small, growing square of yellow wool. It was a promise, a new beginning. I thought about how different this silence was from the one Marcus had left behind that first day. That one had been heavy and cold. This one was light and full of warmth. A few days later, I was having my morning coffee and reading the local paper. My eyes caught a small headline on page 3. Golden Meadows Assisted Living Under Investigation. I felt a chill run right down my spine, cold as ice water. The article mentioned complaints of neglect, of residents not being cared for properly. I read about families who were heartbroken and angry. I thought of the glossy brochure, the smiling, empty faces. I thought of the pre-filled application with my name on it. I put the paper down, my hand trembling just a little. That could have been my story. That could have been me. I walked over to my desk, took out my checkbook, and wrote a large check to the county's legal aid fund for seniors. I sealed it in an envelope, making sure my name was nowhere on it. It felt like closing a door on a room I never wanted to see again. But I couldn't stop thinking about the women who were still trapped inside. For my 73rd birthday, Clara and my friends threw me a surprise party in my garden. The roses were in full bloom, and their perfume hung in the warm evening air. Little white lights were strung up in the branches of the old oak tree. Carol from my bridge club handed me a glass of champagne. "To Eleanor," she said, her voice clear and strong. "The best chairwoman I know." Everyone laughed and raised their glasses. There were no sad speeches about getting older, no gentle pats on the arm. There was just loud conversation, good food from the church potluck, and real, honest laughter. Clara came over and gave me a hug, her belly pressing gently against me. "Happy birthday, Mum," she whispered. "I'm so glad you're here." I looked around at the faces of my friends, my daughter, my chosen family. A year ago, I had felt so alone in this house. Now, it was overflowing. A few days after the party, a simple white envelope arrived in the mail. The handwriting was Marcus's. I almost threw it away, but something made me open it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, not a card. It had just 2 sentences. "I am sorry for trying to take your home. I was wrong." I read the words over and over. It was the first time he had said it, the real thing I needed to hear. He wasn't sorry for himself. He was sorry for what he did. I didn't feel forgiveness, not yet. But the cold, hard knot of anger in my chest loosened just a little. I didn't reply to the letter. I folded it carefully and put it in the back of my desk drawer, behind a stack of old recipes. It was a seed of something, perhaps, for a future I couldn't see yet. For now, it was enough that it was there. I was sitting on my porch swing at dusk, a warm cup of tea in my hands. The old chains creaked a familiar rhythm. Clara sat beside me, her own cup resting on her round belly. We didn't talk much. We just watched the fireflies begin to glow in the garden Robert and I had planted so many years ago. The air smelled sweet, like cut grass and night-blooming jasmine. I felt Clara lean her head on my shoulder for a moment, a comfortable, trusting weight. I was not just the keeper of my husband's legacy, I was the architect of my own. and it was finally quiet.